about torture and its relations and occurrence in democracies with Darius Rejali in the first place. We are very honored to have him here. He is the author of a big book which has just appeared. I'll show to you, Torture and Democracy, in 2007. And he won the prestigious American Prize for this book, the Human Rights Book of the Year from the American Political Science Association.
The question isn't whether torture is compatible with democratic life, but how is it compatible, and how have democracies become such powerful torture innovators? Now, since the economic downturn some months ago, we've all become economists, watching our retirement accounts disappear. So I'm going to use an economic analogy that torture has a demand side and a supply side. So where does the demand for torture come from? It comes from 5 different places. And for this, it doesn't really matter whether the state is authoritarian or democratic, but certainly these have always been documented. So you might think that most of the demand for torture comes from national emergencies in which there's a perceived threat or a real threat, and time is short, the so-called ticking time bomb example. That's actually not really the case. Actually, if you take all these cases together that are of that sort, they probably add up to maybe no more than 1/3 of all the cases of torture in democratic societies. Torture also arises locally as a quiet arrangement between police, local businessmen, and homeowners. So homeowners want safe streets, good housing values, and they want to look the other way, and they don't care what the police does. This is what torture was like in Chicago between 1973 and 1991, one of the greatest, possibly the greatest torture case in the United States at the moment. It's domestic. It involved close to 50 detectives, with most of the cases implicating the second-in-command in the Chicago police, John Burge, and is a source of major multi-million-dollar lawsuits which the city of Chicago will continue to pay out for the next decade. Now, this is the torture that wasn't about terrorism. It was just... We sometimes think that when a war ends, we'll be safe, but that's really not how it works. There's really no line between domestic and international torture. And what happens out there always comes back. Usually there's a 20-year shadow, and one of the reasons why I promote my book is I say you need it sometime soon, because torture will be in a neighborhood near you. Certainly in America, that's what I say. Lastly, once a government authorizes torture, many are drawn to government service just so that they can become the Jack Bauers of tomorrow. I don't know how many of you watch 24, the television series, or even if it's here, but it's a famous ticking time bomb situation. But if you think about it, when a government tortures, many people are attracted to government service so that they can be heroes of that sort. And so sooner or later, a split develops within an intelligence organization between those who favor torture and those who are the professionals. And sooner or later, one side or the other loses. So in the 1970s, for example, the Brazilian military turned on its own torturers, recognizing how torture led to military indiscipline, black marketeering, and bureaucratic devolution. But sometimes, and this is the other side loses, the professionals, and they retire from government agencies in large numbers. Torture has a very well-known deprofessionalizing effect. And so, even if the government changes, the pro-torture people will stay in their jobs long after the president has changed. And there the demand for torture is always present. So those are the 5 sources of torture, demand for torture: emergencies, confessional systems, local arrangements, returning soldiers, and embedded in security bureaucracies. Now, let me turn to the supply side. Now, when you think about torture, it's funny, I'm giving this talk in Amsterdam because every time I talk about this, everyone says, have you seen the torture museum in Amsterdam? And it's like, yeah, they did some really creepy things back then. And the answer is, and this is a common problem I have, When you think about torture, people think that the torturer's choice of technique comes from his own abnormal sense of psychology. That's not really the case. Our studies of torturers show that they're almost always normal people, not sadists. Torturers are chosen because they're loyal, patriotic, obedient, and can keep a secret. Organizations that torture don't like sadists because sadists don't obey the rules. They always do things for their own pleasure. Torture actually is a craft, and I like to compare it to massage or tailoring, which are also crafts that work with the body. You can get bad massages, or you can get bad tailors who all do one-size-fits-all things, or you can do those who do the individual fits. So too with torturers, you can get one-size-fits-all violence, or you can get the individualized approach. And like masseurs, torturers have styles. They are creatures of habit, and they induct people into their groups by saying, okay, if you want to work here, this is how we do it. They combine torture techniques in very predictable ways, and each style has a history. So 12 years ago, I began the difficult, if not ridiculous, project of mapping how torture technology spread around the globe in the course of 200 years, which yielded an 800-page book. I mapped each technique as it changed decade by decade, noting who used it, when, how it spread, and its effects. To be sure, now this is really unpleasant work. And for example, to think of how a leg clamp works, which is a very strange device, or to know that the Gestapo was the first person that used a leg clamp, and that the use of the leg clamp by the Gestapo was limited and starts only in the 1940s and is used in a broad arc from northern France to Belgium to Holland to Norway and Denmark, but nowhere else in Gestapo Europe, is something that generally most people don't know. This is very nasty work. It took 3 summers just to map Gestapo torture techniques by place and year. But the truth is that we know more about how hybrid corn seeds spread in Iowa than we know about how police use torture techniques. Now, my work yields a very surprising, very few marks. It appeared first in French colonies, particularly in Vietnam in 1931, and was introduced into the Nazi police in southern France by Vichy policemen under the command of Inspector Marty in 1943, and then spread around the world. Anglo-Saxon modern is older. It is a combination of sleep deprivation, exhaustion exercises, forced standing, and most of these techniques come from either former British military punishments or French ones,